Now,
All right.
we are now
We're
connected.
live.
We are now live on my YouTube. Are you going to go?
Well, if you shoot me a link, I'll put it up on Twitter in case anyone wants to join us from my crowd.
Do, do, do. That's YouTube Studio. I think that's my YouTube Studio, so you're probably not going to be getting there. Let me. I'm not 100%. Let's see. Oh, share. There it is. There it is. Got it. Hold on.
All right.
Because I've never shared my live streaming link before. There you go.
Okay.
So you can drop that on the Facebooks and the Twitters, and who knows, maybe during the live stream you'll hit that 4,000 mark.
Oh, wouldn't that be amazing?
Drop me the link to your Kickstarter also.
HeinleinSecrets.com.
HeinleinSecrets.com. I'm going to copy and paste that and make sure that that goes somewhere, because he has one of those names, you know. Look at that. It does save. That is now in the stream. We currently have 0 viewers, which is awesome.
It's the right number for when we're working all the weird shit out. I'm tempted to go get a pipe just for the theatrical.
You know what? I almost was going to ask you, you're going to have a pipe or a cigar during this.
I may do that. I'm going to go get my paraphernalia, and I'll be back in a moment.
I will be here.
Walk off with the microphone.
You're going to drag your headphones with you?
So are we still alone?
No, we got 750 viewers. Oh, yeah, we're still on.
Well, that would have been something. Then we would have had to actually be entertaining.
God, no. Heaven forbid that should happen. I did, as I was flipping through social media, posting that, one of my friends posted on Facebook, "Don't be embarrassed to wear a mask in public. Some people wear Seahawks jerseys." It took me a second, and I'm like, oh my God, that's awesome. I need to send that to my brother.
You a Seahawks fan?
No, my brother lives in Seattle, but he's a Vikings fan, so he will wear his Vikings jersey to Seahawks games, and it's
Nice.
hilarious.
Yeah. Kitty is a big Seahawks fan. Her most precious inheritance from her father was his collection of Seahawks jerseys.
Oh my gosh,
So she's been very gradually wearing them out.
that's funny.
Yeah.
So as soon as you get that lit, we'll get all the intro stuff out of the way.
All right.
You're looking more and more like Heinlein every minute.
Well, thank you. I think.
I can't believe we actually got this to work.
Woohoo! All right.
According to the stream, we're still at 0, but it'll be up all month long. Not a problem. Good evening and welcome to 5 A Day with Jay. I am J.R. Murdock. With me is Dan Sawyer. Dan, go ahead and introduce yourself.
My name is J. Daniel Sawyer. I'm the author of 30 books, some of them mysteries, including the Clark Lantham Mystery Series, quite a number of science fiction books, including Down from 10, The Resurrection Junket, Suave Rob's Awesome Adventures series, and Hadrian's Flight, which was my first Heinlein juvenile book. I've got a bunch more on deck coming out, as well as a whole bunch of nonfiction, fantasy, short stories, all sorts of stuff. I've been around for a while and podcasting forever. I podcast at theeverydaynovelist.com almost every day, where we talk creativity, history, process management, business, anything that you can imagine that in any way even vaguely connects to the business of being a writer and being a creative person. If I can find some way to shoehorn it in and someone has sent in a question that vaguely touches on it, I'll go there. So it's kind of fun.
Writing covers a wide range of topics, so it's always fun to do that. So, as Dan mentioned there, he is an author of many books. I am also an author of many books. So if you're watching this over on Dan's channel instead of on my channel, I am J.R. Murdock, author of V&A Shipping, Billy Barbarian, the Golden West trilogy, which is a steampunk western. I believe I went through and Golden West is a fun series.
Yeah, no, I remember the books. I've just forgotten they were yours.
Yes,
So,
yes, very fun books. Did a giveaway last week on that. I'm doing a giveaway on my Supernatural Learning series, which is my middle grade series. There's 3 books in that right now.
nice.
Going gangbusters. Already given away 27 copies of all 3 books, and it's like the reason I'm doing the giveaway on a lot of my books right now is because I'm about to go wide. Everything on my Kindle Unlimited expires on September 28th, and I'm like, you know what? On almost everything of mine except for my V&A Universe books, which is V&A Shipping, Giant Robot Planetary Competition, and Almost Superheroes. All 3 of those series tied together in one large umbrella. Everything else that's not that, because that's my space opera, I'm moving wide distribution. I'm going as wide as possible, so I figured, you know what, let's do one blast blowout with a giveaway on all the books. I did 3 last week, I'm doing 3 this week, I'm doing 3 next week. Once they're all done,
Excellent. Hopefully, get some momentum that'll carry over to sales when it goes wide.
that is the goal. That is the goal. And even if I don't, you know what? Hey, I'm gonna give it a go. See what happens. I'm going to also be going wide with all of my short stories, so I need to pull all those out of Kindle Unlimited as well and get those ready to go. But since a lot of them recently launched, it'll take time to get those distributed. But I've got 10 short stories up on Amazon right now, and I just put out I will be putting out a collection in a month. Just released Almost Superheroes Book 2. Got V&A Shipping Book 3 on deck. Got that one all scheduled and ready to go. Having a fun time publishing. It's a good time to be an indie publisher.
Excellent.
It's definitely a good
It
time,
is.
and it's just a matter of one thing that you and I have been trying for so long is getting traction. But we're not here to talk about traction on that. We're here to talk about traction on your Kickstarter, because somebody
Yes.
didn't talk to me before he launched his Kickstarter, and it always irritates me when my friends launch their Kickstarters and I look at it and go, oh, there is so much else you could have done. Let's talk. And fortunately, I caught you the day you launched it. And the day you launched it, you had already successfully funded, which was incredible. Congratulations on that. Very proud that that hit its mark. I'm hoping that some of the advice and suggestions I gave have come to fruition and help increase the funding a little bit. Um,
Yeah.
so let's talk about your Kickstarter a little bit. What is your funding goal and what is your funding at currently?
My funding goal was $1,000, and let's see where it is right now. Make sure it hasn't changed in the last 5 minutes, which would be amazing if it had. Let's see. 3970 is where we're at right now. So we're $30 from busting through stretch goal number 2.
So somebody's just got to pick up a print version and you're done.
That's pretty much it, yeah. And then after that, I'll roll out the next stretch goals and hope that will inspire people to come back for more.
Yeah, and that's stretch goals, add-ons. It inspires people to come back and keep tapping and seeing what's happening. It also gets people talking about it, which is the other good thing. Is people like, oh, hey, did you see this? Did you see that? But we didn't talk about what is your Kickstarter all about. So let's dip into that. What is your Kickstarter all about?
It's to launch the book, The Secrets of the Heinlein Juvenile, which is the first ever in-depth study of Robert Heinlein's juvenile books. Those 12 books plus a few extras that were responsible for creating the genre of military science fiction, the genre of YA science fiction, and several other subgenres that have reverberated through the 20th and 21st century. They were instrumental in the movement to end the draft. They were instrumental in getting all of the men who walked on the moon to join NASA as test pilots. These have been incredibly, hugely influential books, and and they of course inspired all manner of authors to get into writing. And over the years, a lot of authors who grew up on them have tried to do what Heinlein did. They've tried to write that kind of story. Ender's Game is a good example. And most of the time, although many of the books are quite good, they don't actually hit the literary form that Heinlein developed. And there's something special about that literary form that I became convinced when I started reading a lot of the contemporaneous YA from the period, because I'm a history junkie and I'm always interested in the history of literature. Kids' books from the period, a lot of them were really good in terms of the writing quality, the plotting, the excitement, but most of them just never got handed down. So something Heinlein did was special in a way that resonated with his audience so much that they hand them to their kids and their kids hand them to their kids. These books have, as a corpus, never been out of print since they were first published. The Heinlein estate uses the Disney Vault strategy where they cycle several in and out of print, but there's always at least a third of them in print and usually more than half. They've never stopped selling in 70 years almost since the first one was written. That begs the question, why? And this book is an attempt to answer that question both for historians of science fiction, for writers, and in a way that hopefully will help teachers and students get their teeth into how to find the riches in the books that they're reading, because there is a lot there.
And I'm glad you hinted on that because that was one of the things that I always thought as well. I remember being in elementary school, high school, whenever I had to do a book report, at the time I was in elementary school, I had a learning disability. So for me, reading was hard. By the time I got to high school,
You also dyslexic?
severely. By the time I got to high school,
Dyslexics of the world untied.
exactly. By the time I got into high school, my dyslexia had been diagnosed, and what they had to realized that the faster I read, the more I could comprehend. If I tried to focus on word after word, things are flip flopping and I'm missing stuff. So they taught me how to speed read. And one of the books they gave me to speed read was one of Heinlein's juvenile books because
Ooh, which one?
I'm in 7th grade. It was Farmer in the Sky. That's why that book, we were talking the other day, and that's why that one sticks with me so much, is that was one of the first books that I sped read, and I read it in a day. And then I read it again the next day. and I read it again the next day, and I'm like, oh my gosh, I can read books. I can actually read books. And then I just started picking
Nice.
up everything out of the. If you look on my little shelf back here, you'll also see a book called Mere Friend, Mere Foe by George Takei. Another book that I picked up because I went to the library and I'm like, well, I want something like this. And it was a thin book, had, fancy guy in the cover with a sword. And I'm like, let's do this. And
Nice.
and that's what got me. Heinlein's first, that book got me going into reading and exploring the science fiction genre. From there, I discovered Bradbury, Asimov, Clarke. I really wanted to explore sci-fi widely. Mere Friend, Mere Foe got me thinking of science fiction fantasy blended together, and then I started exploring and branching off into fantasy. But that impetus was Heinlein. It's There's no other way to explain it.
I first discovered Heinlein on the day he died.
Oh
I
my.
was outside running around with my brothers, and my father, who was not very, he was not the kind of guy who would cry in front of other people very much. I found him on the front stoop, weeping, and I was quite distressed. I was 12 years old. And I asked him what was wrong, and he said, Heinlein died today. And I said, who? And he turns and he looks at me like I'm from Mars.
Like you grew through a third head.
Yeah. And he stands up and he dusts himself off, and he sort of takes me by the arm right here and marches me out to the garage into we had a bunch of shelves with boxes on them. He points up at the top shelf and he says, climb up there and get that box. So I climbed up, I got the box down. It was all of his old Heinlein books. And he dug through and he found Tunnel in the Sky. He said, this was my
Ooh.
first one. Read it. When you're done, come back for more. And I had just um, and just blew through it. I couldn't believe what I was reading. I never read anything like that. I mean, I read and loved Lord of the Rings. I was a huge reader, even though I was terribly dyslexic. Mine shows up more with spelling and writing. And also, I discovered the trick to read out loud to myself pretty young. And when you do that, you sort of root it through the audio center, and so it doesn't hurt as bad, at least for me. But so I was a big reader, but I had never seen a book do what that book did. It was nothing like I expected it from word one. Every page was a surprise, and every time I went back and picked up another Heinlein book, it was the same thing. Every page was a surprise. It never went where you were expecting, but it did it in a way that made you happy it didn't, instead of a way that made you feel betrayed because your expectations were upset or that sort of thing. And so he hooked me good.
And that's where I love discovering authors like you and I both know Dean Wesley Smith very well.
Mm-hmm.
And Dean goes back and refers to Heinlein all the time, talking about Heinlein was a discovery writer. When he sat down and wrote those books, he sat down and wrote the book. He didn't sit there and analyze and hem and haw and pick and choose. He knew where he was going, but he didn't know what was going to happen next. So he sat down
Frequently, yep.
and just wrote the books, which is, I think,
Yeah, he
what.
would when yeah when he was under a deadline. This shows up in his notes. When he was under a deadline, he would sometimes sit down. He would make notes to himself and work out ideas and sort of move them around. But when he got to a certain point where he had a firm idea, then he just sat down and wrote. And then there were quite a few of his books. Most of his short stories and quite a few of his books, he just straight discovery wrote. My favorite story of those is The Door into Summer. He was on his honeymoon, and the cat was going around. He and Jenny had gotten this mountain cabin in Colorado in the dead of winter, and the cat was going around from door to door looking to get out. And every time one of them opened a door, the cat would complain and huff off and look for another door. And Heinlein was getting really pissed off at this cat, and Jenny was like, "Don't be nice to him. He's just looking for the door into summer." And Heinlein
Ding.
said, "Okay, I got to go get the typewriter." Honeymoon's over, and he sequestered himself
Honeymoon's over.
in the spare room, and over the next week and a half, he wrote the book on a typewriter just from the title, "A Door into Summer."
And that's the fascinating thing about so many of his books that are like that. Starship Troopers, very similar. He knew, like you said, he talked a lot about the military, the draft, and he's like, well, what if this were in space? And that's where he spun off Stormship Troopers. so many of his books happen that way, that were just an idea popped and it was just like, ding, need to go write that. And that's what he did. And like you said, he wrote these on a manual typewriter. I mean, a week and a half, 2 weeks, that's how long it took him to write books. And
Right.
I hear people complain about, oh, it takes me so long to write a book. And it's like, all the authors that we've already talked about, Clark, Bradbury, Asimov, Heinlein, they all did this stuff on manual typewriters, thousands of words a day.
Yep.
I'm sorry, I can sit down on this keyboard and I can type 100 words a minute. And it's like, it shouldn't be a problem to type that much. The only thing that slows me down is I get ahead of my brain sometimes and things go wonky. But
Yep.
back to your Kickstarter, I know you talked about teachers and students. Are you going to try and get teachers interested in your Kickstarter, and if so, how?
I was originally going to try to, but with all of the crap going on in the education field around the pandemic, I gave up on that one pretty damn quick. I am still trying to figure out how to get the attention of homeschoolers, though. Because homeschool pods have suddenly gone from being this fringy thing to being mainstream because kids were out of school for a year, and a lot of parents and a lot of kids discovered they did a lot better in the kinds of ad hoc homeschool environments and groups that they were able to put together in their neighborhoods, which, if you know the history of education, should not surprise you.
Right.
But that's my next book is about autodidacticism in the history of education. So that's good. That's already mostly written. But one of the things that is hard to do when you're a homeschooler is curriculum. And if you're doing homeschooling because you're hoping to raise a more independently minded child, getting a pre-packaged full curriculum from some company is often a little off-putting, even though it's very convenient. So I'm trying to figure out how to make this a very attractive a la carte curriculum option. Hence, the first stretch goal was workbooks,
Mm-hmm.
both for one for writers and one for students, so that it makes it easier to use this as a teaching text with any or all of the Heinlein juveniles side by side in a way, hopefully, that will bring extra life to the Heinlein juveniles instead of sucking the life out of them like it's happened with so many of the books we were forced to read in high school.
Right. And I think that was one of the interesting things is I was, much like you, forced to read a lot of things in high school that I didn't enjoy. Heinlein, Farmer in the Sky, was one of the first books I was handed that I didn't feel like I was forced to read it and that I enjoyed discovering and reading. In your analysis that you're going to do with your Kickstarter, are you going to explore an order to read the books? Are you going to explore kind of an amorphous, roundabout way of exploring the books? Or how do you plan on discovering, explaining to the readers how the books flow?
So the way the book is structured, it starts off with an introduction on who Heinlein was and what the juveniles were. Then it moves into it. Then there's a very short chapter talking about which titles the list qualify, including which selections I'm making that will prove controversial given previous Heinlein scholarship. Then I go into the literary traditions, the major literary traditions that Heinlein drew upon to develop the formula. I keep saying formula because I expected it to be a formula, and it's not. It's a literary form. A formula is basically you write something this way, and it's this thing. A form is more of a recipe. It's a formula is house plans, and a form is the town the house is in.
Yes.
Um,
Formula
that's
save the cat.
right. Right. God, oh, don't get me started. So anyway, so there's a chapter explaining the fairly briefly explaining the five major literary traditions, some of them dating back to ancient Babylon, that Heinlein blended in order to create the form. And he blended them. He blended five traditions that were. Four of them are mutually exclusive, and yet he pulled off blending them, which is a hell of a trick. And after that, I go into each individual book and the way they were written. And I summarize in great detail each book. And I talk about how those five major traditions are in play. And then I talk about the background of the writing of the book and what importance it had for the development of the form. sometimes also bring up some of the controversies that the books created, either with the public or with his editor. There was a long feud starting from book 2 with his editor that went all the way through the series, and it both heavily influenced the development of the form and gave birth to some of the most entertaining behind-the-scenes gossip you have ever heard in that book. To the point where the 8th one he wrote, I think it was the 8th one, The Star Beast, is deliberately engineered to get him fired by loading it up with dirty jokes that the kids wouldn't get, but that the editor was supposed to.
He went Looney Tunes.
And after 7 books of giving him shit for embedding dirty jokes that weren't there, she let this book completely pass, almost without comment. The only thing she objected to is that an emancipated minor describes her status as having divorced her parents, and she objected to the word divorce, but not enough to hold the book up.
Interesting.
So there's a lot of stuff like that behind the scenes to help explain why he made the creative choices that he did. And then once I get the main 12 out of the way, I talk about Starship Troopers, Podkane of Mars, and The Menace from Earth. I talk about Podkane because everyone says it's a juvenile, but it's not. And I talk about The Menace from Earth because everyone thinks it's one of his adult novellas, but it's not. It's a juvenile. And then after that, I go into the other major components that make up, or that have to be present for a Heinlein juvenile to work. They provide kind of the lubrication between the gears of these opposing story traditions. So I talk about each one's got 2 layers of mythology. It's got the ancient mythology and the contemporary mythology that are working. Ancient mythology like the story of Pollux and Castor,
Ooh.
the hero's journey, stuff like that, and then references to the Epic of Gilgamesh and stuff. And then the contemporary mythology is genres generally of American and German literature that were popular at the time, like the Western and the Union Tale and stuff like that he imported to give the books a greater sense of immediacy. The Castaway Tale for Tunnel in the Sky, which was the first one I wrote. And then there's a chapter where I go into the moral vision on display throughout the books, because it's not obvious at first reading what the moral vision is, but you get a sense that there's something going on. Are we still live?
We are still live. I apologize. The battery on my camera went dead. I'm going to see if I can switch.
Oh, no.
I'm going to see if I can switch cameras while you find a light.
Okay.
Let's see. All right, I have a new camera. The lighting will be terrible with this camera because the other camera is far superior. Hey, and now you're more than just a floating hat.
All right. Let's see.
You're more than a floating hat now. And my lighting is terrible now because this camera is awful, and my focus will probably twitch a little bit, so I apologize for that. But we are still streaming, still going.
All right. So then after that, there's a couple of chapters where I talk about the way that he puts this all together and what about this combination has made these things last.
Mm-hmm.
I've got there's another chapter in there somewhere that talks about all of the other literary tricks that he uses to create interest investment, the way that he deals with the young adult perspective, how adults, which is the important distinction between a juvenile and a YA. A juvenile is a subspecies of YA that's supposed to be read by the audience that's the same age as the protagonist.
Okay.
Most YA nowadays is read to be written by folks in their 30s and 40s who miss the simple problems that they had when they were teenagers. So, and there's also a section discussing the difference between a power fantasy and a competence fantasy. Most YA written these days are power fantasies. Heinlein's books are competence fantasies. And that changes a lot about how the books are put together, where the narrative emphasis falls, what kind of agency and power the main characters have, and that, of course, changes everything about how the books read.
Oh yeah.
And then the final element that you have to make a Heinlein juvenile work is something I call the endless road. The endless road is, you remember Farmer in the Sky.
Mm-hmm.
Now, when it ends, is the sense that Bill's journey is not over.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely not.
He's finally reached the starting line of the real journey.
Yes. The book is him getting to that.
Yep. Every single one of the Heinlein juveniles ends that way. They all end basically on chapter 1 of the next book. But in such a way that you never expect that there's going to be a sequel. And the reason it does this is that the picture of maturity that Heinlein was building was one where there is no happily ever after. There is only, I've grown up enough to qualify for the next bigger set of problems.
And I think that's one of the really enjoyable things about the juveniles is it's not wrapped up with a pretty bow and done. There are so many young adult books that you read now that young adult has almost become, young romance to a degree, and everything is wrapped up with a pretty bow in the end. And I've never cared for stories where it's completely ambiguous, unambiguous at the end. I like the, ambiguity of what happened, what comes next.
Yeah.
Yep.
Well, and that's the thing. Young kids, like the middle grade audience, they like the tied up in a bow. They like to have a book end and then they move on with their life and they imagine, there's a finish line, there's a happily ever after, ending it like a Disney movie. It works great.
Yep.
Teenagers are old enough to know that that's bullshit, but they're not old enough to escape back into the fantasy in an enjoyable way. And so they want, and I think probably developmentally need, modeling and stories about how it's not all over and happy the moment you fall in love and get married, or the moment that you beat the school bully, or the moment that you prove your land out and you're now officially a homesteader. They are wanting stories that will show them how to get from here to there being the point where they're taken seriously as an adult and can deal with all the adult crap that they are now able to see is there, but that they're not allowed to touch.
Right.
And Heinlein's juveniles concentrate exactly on how do I get from being an immature kid to being someone who's taken seriously as an adult.
And that's the great thing is although they could be considered coming of age stories, there's no impetus where they suddenly go, oh, I'm an adult now. It's just more of a realization of, oh, here are the things that I need to do as an adult. I need to start moving in that direction. And I think that's one of the things for me with the Heinlein juveniles that stuck with me so much is it wasn't so much of, oh, the person is coming of age and they grow up and they just know, oh, well, suddenly I'm adult now. That was never the point of the books, ever. It was always a point of, as you said, there's your path, you go that way, go forth and become a man. They didn't become a man during the story or become a young woman during the story. That was the goal.
They became an adult because of the story, but they didn't. Many of them don't realize it even at the end, but some of them do. In Between Planets, oh God, what's the kid's name in Between Planets? I can't remember. In Between Planets, the main character realizes that the reason that he's at the end, the reason he's behaving petulantly is because he's angry at being treated like a kid. Because he's already been in the war and he's proven himself on the battlefield, and now he's surrounded by people who are treating him like he's his physical age, not like he's his experience.
Right.
And so at that, once he's able to verbalize that, he's able to let go of the petulance and explain that he's willing to negotiate, but on terms that are negotiable, not on terms that are dictated. And one of the few that actually realizes it's going on while it's going on. The rest of them don't realize until the end, and sometimes not at all. Like Jim Marlowe in Red Planet never actually figures out that he's grown up. Everyone around him notices it, he doesn't.
And he
Um,
doesn't even notice other people. It's an evolution,
right.
and that's what growing up is.
Yeah, Matt Dodson in Space Cadet um, gets called into the commandant's office at the end of it, expecting a special commendation for the valor he's displayed under terrible circumstances in a doomed mission, and comes out having been told, "You did an adequate job. Someday you'll qualify to be an officer." And surprised to find that he finds that far more satisfying than he imagined a commendation would be. So, yeah, it's one of the things that really makes the book special. Not a lot of people catch that part.
And I think that's something that just in life in general, that you don't go from being a child to an adult, and there's no flip switch that flips. It's an evolution that, and life is ambiguous. Life keeps going after you reach a certain point. It's not. It's a whole bunch of little individual stories, and I think that's what's so fun about the juveniles is it is a bunch of little individual stories.
Yeah, and it's yeah. You said everything I was going to say. I realized I was just going to restate what you said in different ways.
by all means, by all means, feel free. Um, well, I know I didn't know how long we wanted to plan on talking. We've already covered a lot of ground. Was there any?
It's true.
I know your initial goal was 1,000, and you're almost at four times that amount.
Yep.
What are you looking forward to in the coming days and weeks of this campaign? Since you've still got 3 weeks to go.
Oh, well, I'm hoping that we're able to bust enough of the stretch goals that I'll have to think of some new ones. um, Once we cross the next one, I'll reveal the next two. I may as well talk about them here because hopefully by the time anyone sees this, they've been busted. Um, but the next two are going to be the audiobook production of this book, and then the one after that, the one that intimidates me, frankly, is a sequel called The Secrets of the Heinlein Epic. So Heinlein did this. He did basically three kinds. What was called his early period adult work, which is all those short stories in the future history, and books like Door into Summer and Double Star and whatnot. Most of those early period books were actually written to the juvenile formula, just sort of tweaked a bit.
And that was a lot more of the harder sci-fi that he did.
A lot more harder sci-fi. And then and then he's got the juveniles, and then his later period stuff are these strange, sprawling, almost travelogues full to the brim of conversations that go on forever. And the first time you read them, especially if you've read Heinlein's early stuff, about half the people who read them go, "The fuck is this? Where's the story?" But those that make it through, a substantial portion of them, even the ones that don't like it, come back to them and reread them because there's something about them. And once you got that second read, they stick with you forever, and you come back again and again and again. And there's actually a reason for why that is and how he did it. And so the Secrets of the Heinlein Epic will be talking about the literary techniques that create that irresistible drawback, even when there's an off-putting top layer.
And I think that's something with, as long as we're talking about the epics, when it comes to Heinlein, he's probably one of the few sci-fi authors that I've read multiple times. I've gone back again and again to his books. When it comes to Arthur C. Clarke, he'll write dense books, very hard. I mean, hard sci-fi you could cut glass with. It's so hard.
Yep.
But I read it once. I'm done with the story. Asimov, very hard sci-fi. Some of it almost borderline space opera, but still very hard sci-fi. But once I read it, I'm done. I put it down. When it comes to Heinlein, like you said, you just get that. What did I just read? And you almost feel compelled to go back again and go, okay, no, hold on. I mean, Stranger in a Strange Land. You can't just read that book once and go, yeah, I grok this book. No, you don't grok anything. You need to, once you get to the end, you need to go back to the beginning because it's a cycle. And you go, okay, I missed a whole lot in this book. Friday was supposed to be a very rather straightforward type of book. It's not.
So much there.
Oh, and it was one of those books that I got, and I read it fairly young, and I remember reading it fairly young, going, I don't think I ever want to read that again. And I got into my mid-20s, and I'm like, I think I need to read that book again because I'm confident I missed a lot.
Exactly the same experience. I read it the first time I was 19, and I was like,
Yeah,
every scene is interesting, but the book isn't interesting at all.
but
And then when I was 25, I picked it up again. There was something about it drew me back. And
yeah,
about halfway through, I got it, and I've reread it about a dozen times since.
yep. And so many of his books are like that, and even going back to the juveniles, they're books that, as you said, you can read them as at 10, 12 years old. You can read these books and enjoy the story that's in them. You read them at 15, 16, and you're like, huh, okay, you start picking up some stuff. But you read them as an adult, and you're like, oh, how did he get away with that? How? So many double entendres and hints in there that you're like, you sneaky bastard.
And so many really big and rich ideas.
Yes.
You skim past as a kid. It's like through more adult jokes and Looney Tunes. Right?
Yes.
You know there's something interesting going on there, but you don't quite know what.
Oh, yeah.
But the fact that you noticed it changes the way that you interact with the world with books. And then when you come back, when you get it, you either get a good laugh because it's a hidden dirty joke, or you get your head blown because it's the tip of this deep iceberg full of profound questions of meaning and ethics and philosophy and epistemology, and you can't believe that you just stuck that in plain sight.
And that's one of the great things about the juveniles, especially exploring them as an adult, is he would take a grandiose idea and compact it down to give it to a young reader, knowing they would come back later in life with different experiences behind them, read it and go, no, that's where I learned that. And that's something that you get chills. You're like, oh my gosh, I picked that up from that Heinlein book so many years ago. And I think that's what fascinated me when I saw you were doing this Kickstarter. And I'm like, no, he's really going to go there. Because really, you could do an entire masterclass on Heinlein juveniles because there is so much. I mean, like I said, you're exploring different age ranges and what that age range would experience when reading the books. I mean, there's so much going on, and I don't know if you want to get into how much you're going to explore in that because obviously we want people to go pick up the Kickstarter, but there's just so much to explore, and I'm
Fairly substantial book.
oh I
So, yeah, it's about 100,000 words. Yeah, it's pretty thick.
nice.
Got a proof paperback of it around here somewhere, but it's probably too dark to see it. Yeah, it's a nice thick trade paperback.
Nice. Yeah, it's I'm excited to dive into it. As I said, for sci-fi, like I said, there's so many authors that I've read over the years. I'm the kind that I read a book, I'll give it to somebody else. I'm done with it. And I've done that with Heinlein books, and then I'm like, oh, I want that book back. And I'll go buy another copy. And same thing, I'll get done with it going, you'll have that good feeling. It's like, okay, that's twice or that's three times. I think I can give this one away now. And I've bought so many copies over the years of some of the books that it's just like I said, Farmer in the Sky. That's one of the books I should have on my shelf back here just because I have read that one so many times. Sometimes I forget the title and it's like, wait, wasn't this one of his? And we were talking the other day and you're like, yeah, Farmer in the Sky. And then it clicks back going, why can't I remember that title? But that's something that I love about those books is you can go back to them and get something different out them. I don't know. There's just so many layers in there.
Yep. And writing with layers like that is a learnable skill. I'm absolutely convinced of it, which is one of the reasons I wrote the book. Because I think one of my great frustrations with many of my contemporaries is that we're all ridiculously highly educated for by historical standards for authors, like stupidly highly educated, and so much, and the quality of the prose on display on the current market is fantastic. The way that people turn phrases and control pacing and all the technical tricks are really, really sharp. It's very rare that anyone under the age of what would now be about 55 or 60, it's very rare that anyone under that age turns out a book that can be infinitely reread or that people are going to pass down to their children. Because as sophisticated as our technical education is, our cultural rooting is very, very shallow. Partly because we're the generations that followed the boomers who were like, well, we see all the things that are wrong with our culture, so we're not going to pass those down to our children. And they threw a lot of babies out with a lot of bathtubs and robbed many of us of the opportunity to choose what role we want to play in our culture because they wanted to make sure we played the right ones. And when you look at the cultural depth that's on display in the Heinlein juveniles, in the works of J.R.R. Tolkien, the works of Stephen R. Donaldson, Ursula Le Guin, all of these great authors, they are great authors because they're standing at a junction point between deep history on the one side and the future that they're hoping to speak to on the other.
Oh yeah.
But you have to have access to the history and the depth in order to speak well to the future. And what I'm hoping that this book does is, for writers, it shows them that you can acquire that and you can use that to make your books better. And I'm hoping that for students and fans who are younger, who grew up feeling like they have to cobble together an identity from scratch because they don't belong to any culture they can articulate or identify. I'm hoping that it will show them that they're not alone and they're part of a grand story that goes all the way back, that they can plug into and learn about, and choose what role they want to play. They do not have to plug deep into the past and then become automatons that are saying, we must pass everything on perfectly, we must only be stewards of the great tradition. No, you can be deeply rooted and say, okay, well, this tradition gives me meaning, but some parts of it have got to change because this isn't the same world. But you have to be able to know where you came from in order to make that kind of choice and have any power attached to it.
And tapping on that vein, a lot of books that I've read recently, there is something to be said for a popcorn book or a popcorn movie. Something that you consume and you're like, wow, that was fun. But again, when you go back to the Heinlein juveniles and any of the Heinlein books, when you start layering things on there, that's when you almost need to go back and reread it because you know you missed something. Whereas a popcorn book, you're going to read it once, be like, well, that was fun, and you might give the book away, or you're just done with it.
And you literally may never think of it again.
No, I mean it was good for that moment, and you're done. I read a book I would say is similar in that vein. I'm not going to mention the title because the book was well written, it was well edited, but there were no surprises. It was a YA book that became a YA romance in the middle of the book, and I'm like, it wasn't the book I wanted to read. But I'm the type that unless I just cannot get that page to turn, I'm going to finish a book. And I did wind up finishing the book in about 2 days. It was good for what it was, but I will likely forget that book. It's a trilogy now. There's probably going to be more books, but it reminded me a lot of books like Maze Runner and all of those YA type books. Even Twilight could be thrown in there. To me, they're Yeah, it's a popcorn type of book where there's everything's right there on the surface. There's nothing deeper.
Yeah, there's a lot of cleverness that goes into it, but and the mechanics of them are really well done.
Yes. Oh,
But they're
absolutely.
mechanics that serve nothing. They serve nothing except to let you check your mind at the door for a bit.
Yep. Yep. And that's pretty much what those books are like. But then I read a book like more modern books like Ready Player One, Ernest Cline, absolutely incredible book. I haven't read Ready Player Two yet. I have it sitting right here on the desk next to me. I want to read it, even though I've seen negative reviews. But then you get to other authors that are also like that, like Hugh Howey with Dust and
Wool,
Wool.
yeah,
That book threw me for a loop because I hadn't read anything like that in so long, and it was one of the few books that I read that I'm like, we're starting over. We're going back to the beginning because wow, I missed something somewhere along the lines, and
yep,
those are the type of books that when you get to the end, you're like, okay, I know he dropped hints in here that I totally glossed over because I'm expecting a popcorn book and I did not get a popcorn book. I need to go back and figure this out again. So, as you said, those talents still exist, but they're rarer than they. People are very skilled. They can turn a phrase. They can write a great story, great plot. But there's that certain, you got to get beneath the surface. You got to hint at things greater than what the reader is reading at the time, and that's going back to the Heinlein juveniles. He knew kids would come back and rediscover the books. I really feel that he believed that it wasn't just for a young adult to read. It was intended for them to read and then rediscover.
mm-hmm. Yeah. No, it was his sort of mission in life to bring literary respectability to science fiction. He thought that the pulp era, as glorious as it was from a business point of view, had ruined science fiction's reputation that had been so hard won with Jules Verne and H.G. Wells. And it was his personal mission to prove to the world that science fiction was America's poet laureate genre. And so he poured a lot of work into doing incredibly sophisticated literary forms that were accessible and digestible to the popular rather than the academic audience. And he did a very good job at it.
Absolutely, absolutely. And again, the pulp era. I was talking, popcorn books. That's what the pulp books were at the time. Even if you go back to, like the Destroyer and the Executioner, those are popcorn books. There's what you see is on the surface. James Bond. There's nothing deeper. It's all right there out in the open. You're not going to reread it and rediscover something you missed. You might
Yep.
discover a detail you missed, but you're not going to get any deeper than what's right there and being exposed. And I really think that for me, the philosophy and science fiction, the way he melded them together, was something that Asimov, Clarke, Bradbury just didn't do. Those authors had the imagination and the hard science to drive a story forward, but that was the
Yeah,
story.
Bradbury had the heart. Bradbury
Yes,
had so much heart in his stories too.
absolutely,
You very rarely hit that same thing. But like with Something Wicked, particularly, he hit it out of the park. That one's very rereadable.
absolutely. Some of his short stories are as well, but not all.
Oh yeah. Mm-hmm.
But again, it's something, as you said, it can be taught. People can learn how to add that certain layer and build a story versus driving a story. And
Yeah.
there's a very distinct difference.
Yeah, it's a good choice of words. It's or even an even better choice to be growing a story as opposed to driving a story. Um, there is a fractal nature to stories that are rereadable. They unfold in very much the same way a symphony does. They're deep structural cues, and Heinlein's work displays those from the first story, Lifeline, all the way through. Bradbury's best work displays that. Um, Clarke and Asimov, not so much. They weren't interested in that end of things. They were interested in using effective metaphors to communicate interesting ideas about science, and in Clark's case, also spirituality. But he wasn't interested in that journey of that fractal unfolding that you get when you watch, say, a flower grow or a tree grow. Whereas Heinlein and, again, Tolkien, Stephen R. Donaldson, um, Harlan Ellison, sometimes Michael Moorcock,
Oh, Neil
Ray
Gaiman.
Bradbury, Neil Gaiman, they all either always or frequently enough that it's worth tackling everything they did, grabbed grabbed onto the growing a story, and it makes all the difference.
Oh yeah. Well, we are almost at an hour. Did you want to wrap up with anything?
Well, we can pimp our stuff again. You can find the Kickstarter at HeinleinSecrets.com. You can find most of my stuff at jdsawyer.net. You can find my Substack about history and geopolitics at jdanielsawyer.substack.com. And of course, you can find my daily podcast for writers, The Everyday Novelist, at theeverydaynovelist.com.
And once again, I am J.R. Murdock. This has been 5 a Day with Jay for almost an hour. This,
Thanks for having me on, Jay.
Dan, it's been such a great talk, and I'm going to go ahead and stop now, and we will talk very soon. And for those who are watching on my channel, this may become a more regular thing with Dan and I talking. As you can tell, both of us have very similar interests when it comes to writers, authors, a writerly background. We have varying styles of writing. I write some popcorn books. I write some deeper thought books. Dan, for the most part, writes some very deeper thought type books, as well as detective books, which can also be deeper thought books.
There's the Suave Rob books.
Yes, there's Suave Rob.
There are layers there, but they were meant to be popcorn books. The layers snuck in.
I don't think you can write a popcorn book. I would challenge you to write a popcorn book.
Yeah, I've tried. So I actually came to the conclusion a few years ago that one of the most verified literary skills is being able to write an exploitation film. Because to do that in to do that in a way that holds interest and is rewatchable and doesn't get pretentious is so hard. And one of these days I'll figure out how to do that in novel form. But, until then, you can enjoy my failures.
Yes, without being pretentious, without being condescending. Those are the two hardest things to try and bypass when you're getting a story out in that fashion. And I feel you do it well. I haven't read everything you've written, but I have read enough of it to know that definitely would recommend it to others. Anyway,
Thank you.
this has been 5 a Day with Jay. I've been Jay. You've been awesome. Thank you, Dan.